Good evening and welcome to the Passover Potluck, a special event that we are doing together as a church. This evening, we are doing a two-part lesson with a break in between, and I'm thrilled to be able to do the first part to share a lesson with you, and later on, Josh will do the second part, so stay tuned. But first and foremost, I want to thank Whitney and the Brays for opening up your homes. All of us who are here are blessed by your hospitality. Passover is about food and story. As I'm telling you the story of the Passover, please do not let me stop you from enjoying your food. And speaking of stories, I'm sure many of us have seen or have at least heard of the movie The Prince of Egypt. And the two main characters are Moses and Ramses the Pharaoh. In the movie, Moses confronted Ramses and demanded, "Let my people go." And this really resonates with the American sensibility of freedom and individual rights. And just like the movie, we all know the book of Exodus is about freedom from slavery. But I wonder if you realize that Exodus never mentions freedom. Slavery, yes, and many times, but not freedom. The only time it almost mentions it is in the name of a place called Pi Hahirot, which contains the word Herat, freedom. But that hardly counts, right? Therefore, we have a puzzle. The book that is supposed to be about freedom doesn't actually talk about freedom at all. And why is that? This is the most important question that I would like you to hold on to throughout this lesson. But first, let's talk about Pharaoh. Many people believe that Ramses is the Pharaoh in Exodus, and the name Ramses is actually a composite of two words, the sun god Ra and Mesi, which means child. It implies that only Ramses is the child of God. Only he has access to the gods, and only he has the authority to rule the world. His religion speaks the language of power and dominance. And that's why the ancient Egypt is the archetype of national idolatry and the imperial cult. And it is in this world of national idolatry that the story of Exodus takes place. Out of the imperial Egypt, God takes an oppressed people and makes them into a new nation. And God does this through a man called Moses. This is our Passover story. The Bible gives us an account of how Moses got his name. And the story goes that Pharaoh gave an order to kill all the newborn males of the Hebrews in his land. And a Hebrew mother tried to save her child by putting him in a basket covered with tar and just let it float down the river. As the basket was floating down the river, it came to an Egyptian princess who happened to be bathing by the river. She found the boy in the basket, adopted him as her own, and named him Moses, saying, "For I draw him out of the water." Ki min hamayin mushitihu. The phrase mushitihu contains the word masha, drawing out, which gives us Moshe, Moses. The story of how Moses got his name is in itself a brilliant stroke of literary genius, because it foreshadows the story of God leading the Israelites through the Red Sea, effectively drawing them out of the water. But at the same time, the Bible is playing a clever trick on us, and it does so with the most obvious puzzle. It says that the name Moses, Moshe, is a wordplay on another Hebrew word, Masha, drawing out. But at the same time, it says that an Egyptian princess picks the name. It is very unlikely that she would know the Hebrew language, let alone naming a child using a Hebrew word pun. If anything, she should give the boy an Egyptian name. And indeed, Moses is an Egyptian name, Mesi. We saw this word before in the name Ramses, Ra Mesi, the child of the sun god Ra. But Moses, Mesi, just a child, a slave child, floated in a basket right into the household of Ramses, the sun god child, who is trying to kill him and would later grow up and liberate the slaves from Ramses' household, the house of bondage. Therefore, we see in both the surface and the hidden meanings of Moses' name a powerful message of protest against the empire and its degradation of human dignity. It is as if God is saying, "I am the God of every child, and I refuse to be subjugated by a few people to become their personal properties." In God's economy, worshiping God and honoring others cannot be compartmentalized. In other words, freedom, as it were, is not an abstract concept in the Bible. Freedom is the tangible result of healthy relationships that we work hard for, both vertically between human and God and horizontally between human beings. The most defining moment for the nation of Israel is undoubtedly the revelation at Mount Sinai, where God spoke the Ten Commandments to the entire people of Israel, and everybody heard it. The Ten Commandments begins as follows. I, Yahweh, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me, and you shall not make for yourself a sculptured image of any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. This is the Ten Commandments that we all are familiar with. It goes with this pattern of saying, you shall not, you shall not. But all of a sudden, after God said the second commandment we just read, for some reason, God interrupted himself and said something very different. And this is what it sounds like. I, your God Yahweh, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the thousandth generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. And for the sake of the lesson, I will call this the I am speech. When Torah breaks patterns like this, it is often an indication of a larger pattern at play, and we need to pay attention. Do we see this I am speech somewhere else in the Torah? And sure enough, a nearly identical one takes place 14 chapters later. The Lord came down in a cloud and stood with him there, meaning with Moses, and proclaiming the name Yahweh. Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet not remitting all punishment, but visiting the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the third and fourth generations. This is essentially the same speech as the one we just read before. And these two I am speeches form a huge parenthesis into what we call a chiasmus, a literary structure of A, B, C, C, B, A. And this is what it looks like. The two I am speeches make up the top and the bottom of the chiasmus, the A parts. And after the first speech, Israel accepts God's covenant, which corresponds to God accepting Israel's repentance before the second part. This is the B parts. And in the middle, the C parts. God instructs Moses to build a tabernacle on the mountain. And at the same time, the Israelites are building a golden calf below the mountain. As you can see, at the center of this huge narrative arc is the crisis of the golden calf. And the irony between what happens on the mountain and below the mountain only adds insult to the injury. And it is impossible to overstate the severity of the offense in God's eyes. Remember, the 10 plagues back in Egypt, terrifying though they were, they never came close to being a threat from God to wipe out the entire Egypt. But here at Mount Sinai, because the Israelites are building a statue out of gold, God, in his own words, said to Moses, "Let me be, and do not try to stop me, that my anger may burn against them, that I may destroy them." And this is very bad. But why would the Israelites do such a thing? After all, they have just seen and survived what God has done in Egypt. They know that God is not to be trifled with. The Bible recounts the event as follows. Moses, the representative of God, had been up on the mountain for a little far too long for the people's patience. As the people are growing impatient, they confronted Aaron, and they say, "Come, make us an Elohim who shall go before us. For the fellow Moses, the man who brought us out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." So Aaron collects gold jewelries from the Israelites and make it into a golden calf. And he said to the Israelites, "This is your Elohim, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." Up to this point, Moses has been the sole representative of God in the midst of Israel, and his whereabouts is now in question. What the people demanded is a replacement of Moses, not God per se. And here we do need to be a little relaxed on how the Israelites use the word Elohim, for we cannot be too demanding on theology from a people who until recently were slaves under the Pharaoh who called himself the divine king. And the context of the narrative makes it clear that it is Moses' absence that prompted the people to look for his replacement. And that is a legitimate concern. Who can blame them? But what solution did they come up with? Perhaps unsurprisingly, it is to craft an idol, the classic method of telling ourselves that the divine presence is amongst us. But this solution is precisely the one prohibited by the second of the 10 commandments that we just saw, right before God interrupted himself with the I am speech. Now, at the risk of me being guilty of speculating the rationale behind the commandment, I will proceed to argue that when we give ourselves the permission to shape something out of our own likings and then declare it worthy of reverence, we set in motion the social political forces that will eventually lead us into becoming another Egypt. How does that work? Sooner or later, the idols, and especially the power to sustain the idols, will fall under the control of a selected few who are more capable than the others to dictate the narratives, and with that comes real power. From then on, the division of the privileged and the oppressed becomes systematized. And what we get is a new Egypt and a new Pharaoh, not in name, but in deed. And this is perhaps why the prohibition of idolatry is a must for Israel. And Israel's early commitment to the idolatry must be stopped from the very get-go. Even though they say that what they are building is in the name of God who brought them out of Egypt. But by going down this road of idol making, they will eventually become another Egypt. They may enjoy the breath of freedom for now, and they may be free from the oppressor from now, but this road will lead them down to become a new oppressor, and freedom will die in their own hands. And Passover will ultimately be meaningless. And now we are ready to take a plunge into the power of Passover. It is not just about setting the powerless and the oppressed free, even though that is something worthy of celebrating. The first act of liberation must be followed by the second act of a new creation, a new peoplehood that insists on resisting giving in to what everybody else is doing, namely the idol making and the myth making that will inevitably lead to the abuse of power. The Passover of Yahweh is far more ambitious than any liberation movements ever devised in human history. All other liberations had and will eventually bend to the weight of any new power imbalance. But the Passover movement defies this political gravity because it is after the freedom that truly lasts. How does it do that? It does so by not only reshuffling the powerful and the oppressed, as in the case of the Egyptians and the Israelites, but with grace and forgiveness, it demands a complete change of the hearts and minds in those who have signed up for the project, as in the case of the repentance that follows the crisis of the golden calf. Even the greatest miracles, as in the 10 plagues in Egypt and the dividing of the Red Sea, and the greatest revelation in human history, as in the encounter of God at Mount Sinai, cannot affect an internal change in our hearts. Salvation is a gift given freely by God. Transformation and growth, on the other hand, requires our efforts. And it is this part that we find the potential to realize the vision of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And do not think that this Passover vision of an everlasting peace is for Israel alone. It may begin with Israel, but it is meant to project out to all the nations, just like the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 12 of his book says. He envisions a time when every nation and every people will find their own exile and exodus, a Passover for all nations, so that they too will become the agents of the everlasting peace for all humanity. We have come full circle, and it is time to answer the puzzle that we laid out at the beginning of this lesson. Why is it that Exodus, the book that is supposed to be about liberation and freedom, not mentioning freedom at all? And the answer is that Exodus is never about freedom, but about to whom we are called to serve. In the movie The Prince of Egypt, Moses repeatedly cries, "Let my people go." But the movie is only saying the first half of God's demand and leaving out the second half. Let me show you just a small sample of how the full demand sounds like. "Let my son, the people of Israel, go." that he may worship me. Let my people go, that they may celebrate a festival for me in the wilderness. Let us go into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God Yahweh, and many, many more, all in the same patterns. It is about to whom we are called to serve, not to another human being just like us, who is nonetheless created in the same image of God just like us, but to God himself. All freedom that comes from politics, the careful structuring and the restructuring of power, will eventually decay together with that structure. The Passover story makes it clear that the ability to counteract this trend comes from actively serving a God who cannot be bribed, not by our piety, not by our offerings, and certainly not by our most ardent declaration of allegiance, and not by anything as if he needed something from us, and a God who refuses to be domesticated by any nation, any people, any institution, any church as their exclusive deity. From Passover comes a people who has made the mental leap to the new understanding that the God that I serve will judge in righteousness between me and my enemy, and if I mistreat those who oppose me, I should know that it will not go very well for me. And the Passover people are those who not only celebrate the freedom that we enjoy, but constantly train ourselves to not turn a blind eye on those who lack freedom, especially those who are not like us. And just like the prophet Jeremiah, the Passover people will always find themselves as wanderers of this world while staring intensely into the future, into the world to come. For we all know that we cannot be truly free until all nations and all peoples have gone through their Passover and find who they should serve. It is to this people that Moses gave one of the most counterintuitive charge that sounds foolish to many people, but to us is the only way. Do not despise an Egyptian, for you lived as a stranger in his land. Passover does not just deliver us from Egypt. It thoroughly transforms us from within. As we remember Passover today, may we all find the full blessings out of this unbelievably beautiful and moving story.